85 ships stopped. Iran's oil tanks almost full. The regime has days, not weeks, before it breaks. 2 ships, 2 captains, 2 attempts to slip through the most heavily enforced naval blockade in modern history. The MT Skywave and the MT Celestial Sea both believed they had a chance. Both of them were wrong within minutes. But here is what nobody is telling you about those 2 tankers. They were not desperate smuggling runs. They were a calculated test. Iran sent them deliberately on a very specific day to find out if America had blinked. And the answer that came back across that ocean was so immediate, so total, and so final that it should have every senior official in Tehran rethinking everything they thought they knew about what comes next. Because 85 ships into this blockade, the math is not just bad for Iran. The math is now catastrophic. And the clock that was already running has just started running faster. The MT Skywave was the first to go. It was already known, already named, already on the United States sanctions list as a vessel tied directly to Iran's oil export network. Sending it into the blockade zone was not an accident of navigation. Somebody made a decision. Somebody in the IRGC chain of command looked at a map, looked at the blockade, looked at the financial pressure building inside Iran, and decided the risk was worth taking. That decision was wrong. Within minutes of the Skywave crossing into the enforcement zone, a rigid-hull inflatable boat was in the water. American Marines, armed and trained for exactly this scenario, were climbing the side of that tanker before its captain had time to consider his options. No warning shots, no long negotiations over radio, no diplomatic delay, just a fast, clean boarding operation that ended with the ship in American hands and its cargo going nowhere. And then, as if the lesson needed to be delivered twice in a single day, the MT Celestial Sea appeared. This one was different in a way that matters. This ship was flying the Iranian flag openly. No disguise, no deceptive registration, no attempt to hide its origin or its loyalties. It was a direct test. Iran wanted to know if the Americans would board a vessel that was visibly, officially, undeniably theirs. The answer arrived before the question had finished being asked. American forces went aboard, they checked the cargo, they confirmed the destination, and they delivered the exact same message that 83 ships had already received before the Skywave and the Celestial Sea even left port. The number is 85, and that number is the most important fact in this entire story. 85 ships intercepted, boarded, or turned back in just 38 days. Run the arithmetic and it comes out to more than 2 ships every single day, with no weekends off, no holidays observed, no gaps in enforcement, no grace given to vessels that decided to try their luck. That kind of consistency is not an accident. That is a deliberate operational tempo maintained by a force that knows exactly what it is doing and exactly why it is doing it. The man at the center of this operation is Admiral Brad Cooper, the commander overseeing what has quietly become one of the most consequential naval campaigns in modern American military history. When Admiral Cooper spoke publicly about the state of Iranian naval power in the region, he did it with the calm of a man reading a weather forecast. He stated, without drama and without qualification, that there was not a single Iranian warship moving in the Arabian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, or the Gulf of Oman, not one. And then he explained why. The Iranian Navy's surface combat capability has been reduced by 92%. That is not a rounding error. That is not spin. That is the operational reality of what has been happening in those waters over the weeks leading up to May 20th. The force that Iran relies on to project power in its own backyard has been functionally dismantled. And into the space where that force used to be, Admiral Cooper has positioned something Iran has no answer for. 3 full carrier strike groups, 1 in the Arabian Sea, 1 in the Red Sea, 1 in the Indian Ocean. Together, they form a triangle of naval power that covers every approach to Iranian waters from every direction simultaneously. The USS Tripoli Amphibious Group is in theater as well, carrying 2,500 Marines who are not there for ceremonial purposes. They are there because boarding tankers is a skill, and those Marines practice it, drill it, and execute it in real conditions when the order comes. Over 15,000 American service members are currently operating in this region. More than 100 aircraft are part of the enforcement architecture. And then there are the elements that never appear on the surface at all. 4 AC-13OJ Ghost Rider gunships are flying over the Strait of Hormuz. One of them carries the call sign Nyx, named after the Greek goddess of the night, and its specific mission is hunting the small, fast attack boats that Iran uses for swarming tactics and harassment operations. The Lockheed Martin Lamprey, an autonomous underwater vehicle, is moving silently through those waters, tracking every Iranian mini-submarine. P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft are mapping the acoustic signature of every underwater contact in the area. RC-135 rivet joint spy planes are flying at 40,000 feet, collecting every signal, every transmission, every communication Iran produces. F-16C and F-16CJ aircraft are mapping the precise locations of Iranian air defense systems to build the targeting database that would be used if the situation escalated beyond the naval phase. This is the wall the MT Skywave and the MT Celestial Sea tried to walk through, not a single wall of steel. A layered, interconnected, sensor-saturated enforcement environment where every vessel, every submarine, every aircraft, and every signal is tracked, cataloged, and responded to. But here is the part nobody is talking about. The blockade is not blocking the Strait of Hormuz. The strait itself remains open international water. Any ship from any nation can pass through it freely. The International Maritime Organization has not been called. International law has not been violated. The legal architecture of this operation is one of its most powerful features, because what the Americans are doing is enforcing a targeted economic blockade specifically against vessels entering or leaving Iranian ports. Any tanker heading to load oil at Kharg Island becomes a target the moment its course takes it toward Iranian territorial waters. Any cargo ship destined for an Iranian port falls into the same category. Every other ship in the region, ships from every other nation carrying every other cargo to every other destination, moves freely and without interference. That precision is intentional. It makes the operation almost impossible to challenge in any international legal forum because Iran cannot stand in front of the world and argue that global shipping has been disrupted when global shipping is flowing normally. The only shipping that is stopped is Iranian shipping, and that fact is the foundation upon which the entire operation rests, and the operation is working. That is where this story changes. This is not a standoff. This is not a stalemate. The numbers tell a story that is accelerating toward a conclusion. Before the blockade began, Iran was exporting approximately 1.85 million barrels of oil per day. At prevailing prices, that generated roughly $500 million every single day. $500 million flowing into the regime, into the IRGC, into the proxy networks, into the militia payrolls, into the political machinery that holds the government together. Goldman Sachs now estimates that Iran has lost approximately 70% of its export volume since the blockade began. 70% of $500 million is $350 million. Every day. Gone. Not reduced, not delayed. Gone. Over 38 days, that accumulates to more than $13 billion in lost revenue. $13 billion that cannot be used to pay soldiers. Cannot be used to fund Hezbollah's operations in Lebanon. Cannot be used to keep the Houthi campaign running in Yemen. Cannot be used to maintain the Basij militia checkpoints that keep order on the streets of Iranian cities. Cannot be used for anything because it does not exist. And this is where the story becomes far more complicated than most people realize. Because the IRGC is not just a military force. It is also a financial empire. It is a business conglomerate. It is a patronage network. It employs hundreds of thousands of people directly and indirectly. It pays salaries, it distributes contracts, it controls import licenses, it runs construction companies and shipping firms. And the lifeblood of all of it, the revenue source that makes all of it possible, is oil money. Strip away the oil money and the entire architecture of IRGC power starts to degrade, not immediately, not in a single day, but consistently, daily, in ways that compound over time. Iran's inflation is already running at double digits per month. Food prices are rising faster than wages. Electricity is being rationed in cities that have never rationed it before. And in one of the most remarkable admissions by any head of government in recent memory, the Iranian president went on national television and asked citizens to use only 2 lights in their homes instead of 10. He asked them to eat less food. The president of an oil-rich nation, sitting on one of the largest petroleum reserves in the world, asked his people to eat less food because the money that should be flowing from that oil is no longer flowing. It is sitting in tankers that cannot move and in storage tanks that are almost full. The storage tanks at Kharg Island are now at 85% capacity. They are filling at approximately 3% per day. In 5 days, those tanks will be completely full. And that is when Iran faces a choice that has no good options. Either the oil overflows and is wasted, or the oil wells are shut down. And here is the part that carries consequences extending years into the future. Shutting down an active oil well is not like turning off a tap. It is a geological event. The pressure inside the reservoir drops. The structure of the rock changes. Irreversible damage can occur to the production capacity of the well. Some wells never return to their previous output levels after being shut down under pressure. This is not a theoretical concern. This is why Treasury Secretary Basant specifically used the word fragile to describe the condition of Iran's oil infrastructure under blockade conditions. The fields are fragile. The wells are fragile. The revenue stream is fragile. And every day the blockade continues, the fragility deepens. This is where the real question becomes apparent. Why would Iran send the MT Skywave and the MT Celestial Sea into that environment on May 20th? Why? With 83 previous failures on the record, with the USS Spruance's cannon fire into the engine room of the MT Tuska still fresh in every captain's memory, did someone in Tehran look at that wall of enforcement and decide to test it again? The answer is not incompetence. The answer is necessity mixed with strategy. Iran does not have the luxury of accepting the blockade as permanent. Every day it holds costs the regime money it cannot afford to lose. So the IRGC keeps probing, keeps testing, keeps looking for any crack, any gap, any moment of inattention or distraction that would let even a single tanker through. Because one tanker that gets through is hundreds of millions of dollars. And in Iran's current financial situation, hundreds of millions of dollars can keep critical systems running for weeks. The MT Skywave was an attempt to exploit the existing sanctions designation gap. If the ship is already designated, maybe the enforcement is less aggressive toward it than toward a new ship. Maybe the boarding teams focus on new contacts. Maybe familiarity breeds a kind of operational complacency. The hypothesis was tested. The hypothesis was wrong. And the MT Celestial Sea was the opposite test. It flew the Iranian flag openly, in clear daylight, as a deliberate provocation designed to see whether the Americans would board a vessel that was unmistakably Iranian sovereign property. The answer was yes. They boarded it. They checked its cargo. They turned it around. And Iran learned that the enforcement is not selective, not policy-driven by flag status, and not susceptible to being tested at the margins. What happened next matters even more, because May 20th was not a randomly chosen date. The day before, on May 19th, President Trump announced a 48-hour pause in American military strikes against Iran. That pause was the result of quiet diplomacy. Gulf state leaders, nations that have their own reasons to prefer a negotiated resolution to a wider military conflict, had approached Trump's team and asked for a brief diplomatic window. They believed that with the right combination of financial pressure and a short breathing space, Iran could be brought to the table for a serious nuclear commitment. Trump agreed to the pause. He stopped the bombing campaign for 48 hours. But he made one thing explicitly clear. The American military remained, in his exact words, locked and loaded. And the blockade, specifically and deliberately, was not included in the pause. It continued at exactly the same operational tempo, with exactly the same rules of engagement, with exactly the same response to any ship that entered the enforcement zone. And what did Iran do on the very first day of that diplomatic pause? They sent the MT Skywave and the MT Celestial Sea into the blockade zone. They were not trying to move oil. They were running a diagnostic on American resolve. They wanted to know if a pause in bombing meant a pause in naval enforcement. They wanted to know if diplomatic courtesy translated into operational softness. They wanted to know if the wall had any give in it at all. The answer was delivered in the same way every previous answer had been delivered. Immediately, completely, and without negotiation. This is what American intelligence analysts call the deception and delay strategy, and it is Iran's primary operational doctrine in moments of pressure. The diplomats say one thing in front of cameras. The IRGC does the opposite behind the scenes. The supreme leader signals openness to discussions while the naval commanders probe the enforcement perimeter. The foreign minister speaks of negotiations while tankers are dispatched to test the naval response. The goal is not to deceive the Americans, who can see all of this happening in real time. The goal is to buy time. Time for domestic conditions to stabilize. Time for a diplomatic intervention by a third party. Time for the Americans to get distracted by another crisis. Time for global oil prices to rise high enough that international pressure mounts to end the blockade regardless of Iran's nuclear posture. But the real question is whether that time exists in any meaningful sense anymore. Because the financial clock inside Iran is not responding to diplomatic gestures, it responds only to oil revenue. And oil revenue has not been restored by negotiations or diplomatic pauses or third-party interventions. It has only been reduced further every day the blockade continues. Here is a detail that does not appear in most reporting on this situation. In the weeks before May 20th, Iran began pulling ancient tankers out of storage, ships that should by any reasonable assessment be in a scrapyard, vessels that were retired years ago because they were too old and too costly to maintain. Iran brought them back into service and anchored them in Iranian waters, not to carry oil to a market, but to use as floating storage tanks. Onshore storage at Kharg Island was filling so fast that Iran needed any additional container volume it could find, anywhere, just to keep the wells running without overflowing the tanks. They turned retired scrapyard ships into emergency floating bathtubs for crude oil, and even those improvised solutions buy only days, not weeks, days. The arithmetic of the situation produces a timeline that Iranian planners can calculate as clearly as anyone else can. Storage tanks full in approximately 5 days at current fill rates. Geological damage to wells if production is not curtailed once storage is full. Revenue losses compounding daily. Domestic economic pressure building toward the threshold that Iran's own Security Council reportedly estimated would produce widespread civil unrest within 6 to 8 weeks of sustained financial pressure. We are well past the halfway point of that estimate as of May 20th, 2026. And this is not a situation Iran can diplomatically reframe. The IRGC Deputy Commander General Dagani recently issued a threat, stated publicly and with apparent seriousness, to restrict oil flows to any country supporting the American blockade. Read that sentence again. Iran is threatening to cut oil exports to countries that support the blockade. Iran, the country whose oil tankers are being boarded and turned back by American Marines. The country whose storage tanks are 85% full. The country whose wells are approaching the moment where they must be shut down or permanently damaged. Iran threatened to do exactly what the blockade is already forcing it to do. It was the threat of an empty hand, delivered with a straight face, in an attempt to project a leverage that no longer exists. The international audience that received that threat understood it for what it was, an indication of how few real options remain. Meanwhile, the markets are responding to the reality rather than the rhetoric. Brent crude has risen above $108 per barrel. The International Energy Agency has described the current situation as the largest supply disruption in the recorded history of the oil market. G7 finance ministers convened in Paris and issued a statement demanding the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, but produced no mechanism for actually achieving that demand. Every government with an interest in stable energy markets wants this situation resolved. Every government with an interest in stable energy markets also recognizes that there is only one party that can resolve it by taking the one specific action that would cause the blockade to end, and that party is Iran. Because the purpose of all of this, the 85 ships, the 3 carrier strike groups, the Marines on the tanker decks, the autonomous underwater vehicles, the Ghost Rider gunships over the Strait, the spy planes at 40,000 feet, the storage tanks filling at Kharg Island, all of it points toward one objective: a written commitment, not a verbal promise, not an unsigned framework, not a joint statement full of diplomatic language designed to mean different things to different audiences. A written, verified commitment from Iran that it will not pursue nuclear weapons. Because verbal commitments have been made before and they have been broken. Spoken agreements have been reached before and they have been abandoned. The entire history of Iranian nuclear diplomacy for the past 2 decades has been a cycle of agreement and reversal, commitment and circumvention, dialogue and escalation. The Americans and the Trump administration specifically have decided that the cycle ends with a piece of paper, a signed document, a commitment that cannot be walked back with a press conference or a reinterpretation or a change in government. The financial lever of the blockade is the force pushing Iran toward that paper. Every tanker stopped adds weight to that lever. Every barrel of oil locked in a storage tank adds more weight. Every soldier whose paycheck shrinks because the IRGC payroll reserve is depleting. Every Basij member standing at a checkpoint wondering when his salary will arrive. Every militia commander in Lebanon or Yemen who receives a smaller transfer than expected, all of them are experiencing the downstream consequences of a lever being pushed toward one outcome: signature or collapse. There is no third door. The MT Skywave is now in American custody. Its cargo is not moving toward any market. Its future is in the hands of the people who boarded it. The MT Celestial Sea was stopped, inspected, and turned back. Both ships became entries in an operational record on May 20th, 2026. Numbers 84 and 85 in a count that grows almost every day. And in the halls where Iran's strategic decisions are made, those numbers are not statistics. They are the sound of a closing door. There will be a next attempt. The IRGC has no choice but to keep searching for the gap that does not exist. Their operational strategy requires it. Their financial desperation demands it. Every failed attempt produces information, even if the information is only confirmation that the enforcement holds at this location, at this time, under these conditions. They will keep sending ships. They will keep changing registrations, changing flags, changing routes, changing timing, trying every variation they can think of to find the one combination that produces a different outcome. But Admiral Cooper's operation is not a static wall. It is an adaptive, intelligent, continuously learning enforcement system that processes each new attempt and adjusts its response accordingly. 34 ships have already turned around before being boarded, their captains doing the math and reaching the same conclusion that the MT Tuska's cannon-riddled engine room made obvious. The wall holds. The question is not whether the wall will hold. The question is what Iran does next at the diplomatic level. The 48-hour pause that President Trump announced on May 19th has a closing time. When it closes, the choice that Iran deferred by sending tankers instead of signatures returns to the foreground with greater urgency. Will there be a written commitment? Will there be a signed document that American intelligence agencies and allied verification teams can use as the baseline for a monitoring regime that actually means something? Or will the bombers that were held back during the pause resume their operations alongside a blockade that never softened? Those are the only two futures that exist in the next 24 to 72 hours. The ocean keeps its watch. The storage tanks keep filling at 3% per day. The financial reserves of the IRGC keep shrinking. The domestic pressure inside Iran keeps building toward the threshold that Iran's own analysts have estimated will produce consequences the regime cannot control. And Admiral Cooper's forces keep doing exactly what they have been doing since day one, with no reduction in tempo, no softening of response, and no indication that the patience of the enforcement operation has any limit that Iran can outlast. 85 ships have learned the lesson that the sea in front of Iranian ports is not an open road. The 86th will learn the same lesson, and the one after that, until the lesson reaches the only place it was always intended to reach. Not the deck of a tanker, not the engine room of a damaged ship, not the satellite feeds tracking vessels that turned around before they were boarded. The destination of this lesson was always a desk in Tehran, a desk where a signature either appears or does not. And everything that is happening in that ocean right now is one long, expensive, legally precise, militarily overwhelming argument for why that signature needs to appear soon. Think about that in the next 24 hours. Watch what Iran does when the diplomatic window closes. Watch whether another tanker appears at the edge of the enforcement zone, or whether something different happens this time. Drop a comment below and tell us where you are watching from and what you think Iran's next move will be. The conversation in the comments on this video is one of the best in this space, and your analysis genuinely matters. If you are not subscribed yet and this is the kind of reporting you want more of, now is the right moment to hit that button. Because this story is not finished. Not by a long way. And we will be here for every development as it comes.